My name is Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. And I'm not going to be talking about that book today. I'm going to be talking about a book of which I'm a co-author along with Matt McManus, Conrad Hamilton, and Marian Trejo, which is... there's an introduction by Slavoj Zizek. Should mention that also. So the name of the book is Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. The fact that I'm talking about this book is why I'm doing the ridiculous gimmicky thing of having some lobster-themed towel wrapped around my shoulders. I'm going to stop doing that now. But in any case, in the part of the book that I wrote, I talked about the relationship between logic and rhetoric, because I regard Peterson as somebody who is very, very bad at making arguments. Much of my chapter of the book is devoted to debunking in a sort of lovingly detailed way his argument that any attempt at implementing Marxist or socialist or egalitarian ideas will lead to gulags. But I think that despite being very bad at arguments, he is pretty good at rhetoric. And I think oftentimes this is something that unsympathetic leftists, like most regular viewers of this channel, don't see, because we dislike what he has to say enough that we are thoroughly immune to his charms. We just see him as this kind of hysterical Canadian Kermit the Frog figure spouting right-wing nonsense. And so we really don't get it. But it's an important point, and in a lot of ways, I view the chapter that I wrote for Myth and Mayhem as kind of the missing rhetoric chapter from Give Them an Argument. If we're going to understand why Peterson appeals to people, I think that we need to kind of understand his rhetorical tricks, the way that even the fact that he has this kind of prairie Canadian accent that's unfamiliar to most of his fans can, in a strange sort of way, make him seem more credible. And, it's like he's coming, he's sort of arrived at us from a great distance to give us these revealed truths. And he really presents a lot of what he says as revealed truths. So I'm not going to get into that too much in this video because I spell it out in great detail in the chapter. But I want to talk about two things in the next few minutes. I want to talk both about why bother and why Peterson has the kind of appeal that he has. First, on the question of why we should bother. I think there's a certain tendency among a lot of very, very clued-in leftists who are sort of constantly monitoring the political situation and tweeting about it, to think that if they haven't personally heard someone's name used in the last 48 hours, then they're no longer relevant and they no longer need to be debunked. There's no reason to try to reach out to people who might be persuaded by their arguments for reactionary conclusions and try to take them through what's wrong with those arguments. And this is a real mistake for a few different reasons, but I think one of the most obvious ones is that even if you think that Slavoj Zizek was completely successful in exposing Peterson at the debate last year in Toronto, and certainly nothing that happened there was a good look for him. Or you think, Peterson's kind of yesterday's news, right? I think that you might be missing a couple things, right? First, on the Zizek point, I think that Zizek was doing something good and valuable in Toronto, which is that most of the ways that that Peterson was discredited in Toronto were what hockey commentators call own goals. That he was essentially just accidentally shoving the puck into his own goal by doing things like giving this ridiculous middle school book report on the Communist Manifesto and admitting that he hadn't read any Marx in decades, and he didn't even bother reading any of Zizek's books before debating him. And when Zizek asked him in a very friendly way to name one of these postmodern Marxists he's always talking about, Peterson wasn't able to do so. That certainly wasn't a good look for him. But Zizek himself, although I think that there was something there just from sort of having, just from the intellectual contrast of the two of them speaking in turn, that was very valuable for showing some people what Peterson is and isn't. But Zizek himself was mostly concerned with doing something else, right? What Zizek, I think, was trying to do, for the most part at least, was nicely summed up by a Canadian journalist named Clifton Mark in an article called What the Media Missed at the Jordan Peterson-Slavoj Zizek Debate, which is this, right? He said, and I quote, "Despite the collegiality, the exchange was unequal. Peterson's expertise is in clinical psychology, not in politics, philosophy, or economics. Zizek's expertise was directly related to the topics of discussion. This made the evening feel like an office hour session between a professor and an earnest but misguided student. Zizek probed and corrected and suggested supplementary reading. But he encouraged Peterson by highlighting points of agreement, cracking jokes, literally begging for Peterson to do the same, and trying to find ways to criticize without humiliating. And in fact, if you recall, there were definitely some leftists who thought that this was horribly disappointing. Why didn't Zizek try to pound Peterson's head against the philosophical pavement and crack his skull? Why was he so friendly? And of course, Zizek wasn't really trying to crack Peterson's metaphorical skull. He was trying to show these confused young men who tend to gravitate to Peterson that there's a version of the left that's not about moralistically policing and scolding people over every little thing, that's much more open and inviting and appealing. That was a really good thing to do. It's a little bit different from the work of sort of going through in detail and showing exactly what's wrong with Peterson's arguments to the extent that he makes arguments, or his assertions to the extent that, as is very often the case, he just asserts things. And very often, Peterson defenders will say, oh, but you haven't read this, you haven't read that, you haven't listened to every hour of the Bible lectures, you haven't read every page of Myth and Mayhem. Sorry, not of Myth and Mayhem, that's our book, of Maps of Meaning. That's Peterson's longer and much less popular book than 12 Rules for Life. You haven't watched this, you haven't listened to that, and so unless you devote the next year to becoming a Peterson scholar, you can't criticize him when he says obviously asinine and incoherent things about, postmodern Marxists trying to herd people into pronoun gulags. All right. So one of the real pieces of the value that's added, not even necessarily by my chapter about Peterson's arguments and his rhetoric, but by the long sections written by Matt and Conrad and Marian, like somebody like Matt McManus. By the way, if you're not reading his stuff, you should. It's tremendously good. One of the clearest and most engaging and rigorous people doing public philosophy from a left-wing perspective right now. But one of the great things about what someone like him brings to this project is that Matt, there can never be the slightest doubt that he really has read every single goddamn word you could hope for him to read of Peterson's output, and he can explain what's wrong with all of it. If you have an uncle maybe who loves Jordan Peterson, then send them this book. Maybe he'll be so bored during the quarantine that he'll hate read all of it, and maybe he'll accidentally learn something. So that's part of the. So again, I think what we're bringing to this is something a little bit different. But the other part is that 12 Rules for Life, last time I checked, the Amazon charts, where they have the 20 most purchased books of the last week, just spent its 120th consecutive week on that list. If you think that critiquing someone like Jordan Peterson is a waste of time because in whatever particular world you inhabit, he's no longer relevant, I would gently suggest, to self-plagiarize a phrase I've used before, that you don't just live in a bubble. You live in a Russian doll-style series of bubbles within bubbles. Vastly more people are paying attention to this guy than any of the left-wing figures that you like. Doesn't mean that we can't that we can't win arguments with his defenders. Doesn't mean that we can't persuade people who are currently listening to people like this. But you can't win if you don't play.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.